Have you ever made a snap decision and then maybe later you look back and think, what was I even thinking? Or I don't know, you hear a single word and suddenly your whole mood just shifts. Our minds, they're amazing, right? But they also take these weird little shortcuts and sometimes they lead us pretty far off track. So today we're doing a deep dive into the work of Daniel Kahneman. He won a Nobel Prize for basically revolutionizing how we understand judgment, decision-making, the whole shebang. We're going to unpack the two basic systems that seem to run our thinking and look at these fascinating, sometimes funny biases that affect us all every day.
Yeah, and our goal here really is to give you some better language, a richer way to talk about and understand these mental hiccups. Not just spotting them in other people, which is easy, right? But crucially, noticing them in yourself. Because, having a clear diagnosis, understanding why you made a certain error, that's the first step toward making, better choices next time. And it's kind of amazing how this whole field started. Kahneman and his collaborator, Amos Tversky, back in, 1969? They found something really surprising. Even highly trained statisticians, people who live and breathe data, weren't always great intuitive statisticians. They'd wildly overestimate if a study's results would replicate, or give pretty bad advice on sample sizes, which really flew in the face of the standard thinking then that humans are, fundamentally rational actors.
Okay, so let's jump right into that core idea, these two modes of thinking. Kahneman calls them System 1 and System 2. What's the basic difference?
Okay, think of System 1 as your brain's autopilot. It's super fast, totally intuitive, runs automatically in the background. It's what lets you instantly know the answer to 2 + 2, or, detect hostility in someone's voice without even thinking about it. You don't consciously analyze the tone, you just get it. It operates with almost zero effort. It just generates impressions, feelings, intuitions.
Right. And System 2 then?
Yeah.
That it feels more like the us we usually think of.
Yeah.
The conscious part that's doing the deliberate thinking.
Exactly. System 2 is your focused mental effort. It's slower. It takes work. When you're trying to figure out, say, 17 times 24.
Ugh, yeah. Definitely effortful.
Or even just trying to stay polite when you're really angry inside. That's System 2, putting in the work, monitoring yourself. It gets called in when System 1 runs into trouble, or when something happens that just doesn't fit System 1's model of the world. If you saw a cat bark. That would definitely trigger System 2. The key thing is, System 1 does most of the heavy lifting quickly and usually pretty well, but it's also the source of a lot of these systematic errors, these biases, and you can't just switch it off.
You can't just decide not to understand words you're reading, for example.
Precisely. It's always on.
It's kind of wild to think about the actual physical effort involved in System 2. Didn't they find a way to measure this? Something about pupils?
Yeah, that's fascinating stuff. Researchers like Eckhart Hess and Kahneman worked on this too. They found that pupil dilation is like a direct window into mental effort. Your pupils literally get bigger the harder your brain is working on a deliberate task.
Yeah.
They had people do these add 1 or add 3 tasks.
Where you add 1 or 3 to each number in a string? Sounds simple, but mentally taxing.
Exactly. And they could just watch the pupils expand as people push through it. It shows the real physical limits of System 2. And it ties into this idea Kahneman calls the law of least effort. Our brains are fundamentally lazy in a way. They prefer to avoid that kind of mental strain whenever possible.
Okay, so if our brains are wired for these shortcuts, this laziness, how much are we really steering this ship? How much control do we actually have?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Because System 1 is constantly being nudged and influenced by things around us, often completely below our conscious radar. Kahneman uses this striking example. Just read the words, bananas vomit.
Okay. Yeah, instantly unpleasant images, maybe even a slight physical reaction.
Right. And you didn't choose to feel that. That's System 1 acting as what he calls an associative machine.
Yeah.
Those words trigger a whole cascade of linked ideas, memories, even physical responses. It even gets at this idea of embodied cognition. We don't just think with our brains, our bodies are involved too.
And this isn't just about weird word pairs, right? There's solid research on these priming effects.
Oh, absolutely. The research is surprisingly robust, and it applies to everyone, even though our System 2 likes to think it's above all that, like simple things. If you've just seen the word eat, you're faster to recognize the word S-O-U-P. If you saw wash, you'd be faster with S-O-P. Makes sense, they're associated.
Okay, that seems fairly straightforward.
But it gets weirder. There's the ideomotor effect. Studies found that if you prime people with words related to old age, like Florida, wrinkle, gray, they actually walk slower down the hallway afterwards.
Seriously? without realizing it.
Totally unconsciously. Or priming people with thoughts about money makes them less likely to help someone pick up dropped pencils. It triggers a kind of self-reliance individualism thing. And maybe my favorite example, they put up a poster in an office kitchen honesty box for coffee money. Sometimes it had flowers, sometimes it had eyes staring straight out.
Let me guess. The eyes made people pay more.
Significantly more. Just that symbolic feeling of being watched, even by a picture, changed behavior. Nobody consciously thought, oh, eyes, I better pay. It was all system one.
Wow. Okay, so that ties into this feeling of cognitive ease, then. That sense that things are running smoothly.
Exactly. Cognitive ease is that feeling that things are familiar, effortless, good. No need to mobilize system two. But, and this is the crucial part, that ease can be misleading. It creates what Kahneman calls illusions of truth. Things that feel easier to process often feel more true. Like studies show people find rhyming aphorisms more insightful than non-rhyming ones conveying the same message.
Woes unite foes sounds wiser than misfortunes unite enemies.
Pretty much. Same goes for company names. Easily pronounced ticker symbols or company names tend to do better initially than awkward ones, just because of that fluency. And then there's the illusion of familiarity. If you've seen a word or name recently, even just flashed briefly, it becomes easier to see or recognize later. And that ease gets misinterpreted by System 1 as familiarity, like you've encountered it significantly before, even if it's a totally made-up name like David Stenbill.
So System 1 gives us this feeling of ease, but it doesn't really tell us if that feeling is justified.
That's the core issue. System 1 registers the ease, but it's not great at checking its sources. And our System 2, being effortful and, let's be honest, often lazy.
Follows a path of least resistance.
Exactly. It often just accepts System 1's suggestion without doing the hard work of checking. We think we're making reasoned judgments, but a lot of the time we're just going with these fluent, easy impressions from System 1. We mistake how easily we process something for how true or good it is.
Okay, so when does this usually reliable System 1 really lead us into trouble? This sounds like where the heuristics and biases idea comes in.
Right. Heuristics are basically those mental shortcuts System 1 uses. They're usually fast and efficient, but they can lead to predictable systematic errors biases. One big one is called substitution. Often, when faced with a difficult question, System 1 just answers an easier one instead, without us noticing.
How does that work?
Kahneman gives this great example. Ask college students 2 questions. First, how happy are you these days? Second, how many dates did you go on last month? The correlation is pretty low, but flip the order. Ask about dates first, then happiness. Suddenly, the correlation shoots way up.
Because thinking about dates brings up feelings happy or sad, and they substitute that feeling for the harder question about overall happiness.
You got it. The recent, easy-to-access emotion about dating gets substituted for the complex judgment about life satisfaction. System 1 answered the easy question.
Okay, that makes sense. What about judging probability? You mentioned the Linda problem earlier.
Right, that's about the representativeness heuristic. We judge how likely something is based on how much it resembles a stereotype or prototype in our minds, often ignoring basic statistical facts like base rates. The classic is the Tom W. description. Participants read a personality sketch of Tom W. nerdy, like sci-fi, not very social, and then guess his likely field of graduate study.
People guess computer science or engineering, right? Because he sounds like the stereotype.
Exactly. Even though statistically there are far more graduate students in humanities or social sciences overall. People ignore the base rate information when the description is compelling. System 1 goes with the stereotype match. And the Linda problem is even starker. You get this description of Linda outspoken, bright, concerned with social justice in college. Then you're asked which is more probable. A, Linda is a bank teller, or B, Linda is a bank teller and is active in the feminist movement.
And most people pick B, even though logically B is a subset of A, so it has to be less probable.
Precisely. But option B creates a more coherent, representative story based on the description. System 1 loves a good story, even if it violates the rules of probability. Logic takes effort. Coherence feels easy.
And then there's the idea that we judge things based on how easily examples come to mind.
Yeah, the availability heuristic. We estimate frequency or probability based on the ease with which instances or occurrences can be brought to mind. This is hugely influenced by media coverage, for example. Dramatic, vivid events stick in our memory. So you might overestimate the risk of, say, dying in a plane crash or a terrorist attack compared to more common but less sensational risks like diabetes or car accidents, just because the dramatic examples are more available mentally.
So the easier it is to recall, the more probable we think it is.
Right. And this often connects to the effect heuristic. Our feelings about something influence our judgment of its risks and benefits. If we feel good about something, we tend to judge risks as low and benefits high, and vice versa. Dread risks, like nuclear power or terrorism, feel riskier than statistics might warrant because of the negative emotions they evoke.
Okay, another one you mentioned is anchoring. How does that work?
Anchoring is our tendency to be influenced by an initial piece of information, the anchor, when making estimates or judgments. We start with that anchor and then adjust, but usually we don't adjust enough. The classic experiment involved a rigged wheel of fortune. People spun it. It landed on either 10 or 65 totally random numbers. Then they were asked to estimate the percentage of African nations in the UN.
And the number they just saw on the wheel influenced their estimate.
Absolutely. People who saw 10 gave significantly lower estimates than those who saw 65. That arbitrary number served as an anchor for their subsequent judgment. You see this all the time in negotiations. The first offer sets an anchor that heavily influences the final price. Kahneman actually suspects it's often more than just deliberate adjustment. Sometimes it seems like a priming effect. Like if you ask people if Gandhi died before or after age 9 or before or after age 140, those absurdly low or high anchors still influence their subsequent estimate of his actual age. System 1 tries to make sense of the anchor, constructing a world where that number is plausible, pulling the estimate towards it.
It really feels like our intuition is constantly setting these little traps for us. This leads into another area, right? Our tendency to be way too confident in our judgments and predictions.
Oh, massively. This gets into the illusion of validity and just plain overconfidence. Our subjective feeling of confidence often comes from the coherence of the story System 1 and System 2 build, not necessarily the quality or quantity of the evidence supporting it. Think about this statistic. Studies of medical clinicians found that when they declared themselves completely certain about a diagnosis, they were still wrong about 40% of the time.
Wow, 40%.
Yeah. Their feeling of certainty was based on the internal consistency of the case narrative they'd constructed, not an objective assessment of probability. And then there's hindsight bias, the "I knew it all along" phenomenon. After an event happens, we reconstruct our past beliefs. We start to feel like we saw it coming much more clearly than we actually did.
Like after a surprise election result, everyone suddenly has a theory explaining why it was inevitable.
Exactly that. Or the Duluth Bridge example Kahneman uses. After a flood damaged a bridge, people were asked if the city should have hired a full-time monitor before the flood. Even when explicitly warned against using hindsight, knowing the outcome, the flood, made people much more likely to say yes. The city was negligent not to have foreseen it. The outcome biases are judgment of the prior decision quality.
This sounds very related to the planning fallacy, too, our tendency to be overly optimistic about future projects.
Definitely. The planning fallacy is our chronic tendency to underestimate the time, costs, and risks of future actions while overestimating the benefits. We focus on our specific plan and neglect the statistics of similar past projects. Kahneman tells a great story about his own experience developing a curriculum. His team was wildly optimistic about how quickly they could finish. When asked to consider how long similar projects usually took, the statistician on the team gave a much, much grimmer forecast, which turned out to be accurate.
They were stuck in the inside view, focusing on their own unique circumstances and plans.
Right. Ignoring the outside view, the statistical track record of comparable efforts. We don't account enough for the unknown unknowns, the unexpected problems that inevitably prop up. This is often fueled by optimistic bias, especially in entrepreneurs. They naturally focus on their own skills and plans, neglecting the competition and the base rates of failure in new businesses. Kahneman somewhat wryly calls them optimistic martyrs. Their individual optimism might lead many to fail, but it drives innovation for the economy as a whole.
So given all these biases, these illusions, are we just stuck, or are there ways to counteract them?
Well, it's tough because System 1 is automatic, but awareness is the first step, and there are strategies. One powerful finding comes from Paul Meehl's work back in the 1950s. Meehl, a clinical psychologist, compared the predictions of expert clinicians with predictions made by simple statistical formulas or algorithms based on a few key variables.
And the formula's won.
Overwhelmingly, across dozens of domains, predicting parole violations, medical diagnoses, academic success, even the future price of Bordeaux wine based on weather data. Simple algorithms consistently outperformed human experts relying on intuition. He called it the robust beauty of improper linear models. Even simple formulas that just add up a few scores often beat nuanced, complex human judgment. Think of the APGAR score for newborns, a simple, quick checklist that's incredibly valuable.
But people resist this idea, right? The hostility to algorithms.
Oh, absolutely. Meal faced huge pushback. Experts have an illusion of skill. They feel their nuanced understanding captures complexities the formula misses, and formulas feel, well, dehumanizing sometimes. We prefer human judgment, even if it's less accurate. But that hostility is slowly changing, I think. Algorithms are becoming so embedded in daily life, movie recommendations, credit scores, navigation apps, that people are getting more used to them. And for practical decision-making, especially in groups, there's a great technique from Gary Klein called the pre-mortem.
Pre-mortem, like before it dies.
Exactly. Before you launch a big project, you gather the team and say, okay, imagine it's a year from now, and this project has been a complete disaster, total failure. Take 5 minutes and write a brief history of why it failed.
So it legitimizes doubt and encourages people to look for potential flaws without seeming disloyal.
Precisely. It breaks through groupthink and taps into that critical thinking by making it safe to imagine failure. It can uncover risks the optimistic planning phase might have missed.
Let's shift gears slightly. How does this thinking apply to how we actually value things, like gains and losses? Is that rational?
Not entirely. According to Kahneman and Tversky's prospect theory, which actually won Kahneman the Nobel, it's a descriptive theory of how people actually make decisions involving risk, contrasting with older expected utility theory, which assumed pure rationality. A core idea is that we evaluate outcomes relative to a reference point, usually our current state or the status quo, not in terms of absolute wealth. We think in terms of gains and losses from that point. And the crucial insight is loss aversion. Losses loom larger than equivalent gains. Losing $100 feels much worse than gaining $100 feels good.
How much worse?
The typical loss aversion ratio is somewhere between 1.5 and 2.5. We hate losing something about twice as much as we like gaining the same thing. This explains the endowment effect. People demand significantly more money to sell something they already own, like a coffee mug given to them in an experiment, than they would be willing to pay to acquire the exact same item if they didn't own it. Owning it makes losing it feel like a loss, which hurts more.
So giving something up feels worse than gaining it feels good.
Right. And even our goals act as reference points. Think about New York cab drivers. Economically, they should work longer hours on busy days and knock off early on slow days. But studies found many do the opposite. They have a daily income target in mind. On slow days, they work longer to avoid the loss of not hitting their target. On busy days, they hit it quickly and might go home early, foregoing potential extra gains. Loss aversion drives the effort.
Prospect theory also talks about how we handle probabilities, doesn't it? Not just the gains and losses themselves.
Yes, exactly. It highlights two key effects in how we weight probabilities. First, the certainty effect. Outcomes that are almost certain are given less weight than their probability suggests. We undervalue the difference between, say, 95% probable and 100% certain. Conversely, there's the possibility effect. Very low probability outcomes are overweighted. We pay more attention to the difference between 0% and, say, 5% than the statistics warrant. This is why lottery tickets are popular. The small possibility of a huge win is psychologically overweighted.
So we disproportionately value certainty and disproportionately fear tiny risks becoming possible.
Right. We'll often pay a premium for absolute certainty to reduce a risk from, say, 1% to 0% compared to reducing the same risk by the same amount, like from 6% to 5%. Think about people willing to pay a lot for an insecticide that eliminates a tiny risk completely, rather than one that reduces it significantly but not totally. And how risks are described matters hugely here. Vivid imagery or focusing on the numerator without the denominator, this procedure saves 90 out of 100 lives, sounds better than this procedure has a 10% mortality rate. Or framing DNA evidence as a 1 in 1,000 chance of a false match sounds scarier and more impactful than saying a 0.1% chance of a false match, even though they're identical statistically. System 1 grabs onto the concrete numbers and images.
This leads us to maybe the most profound distinction Kahneman makes: the difference between the self that lives to experiences and the self that remembers them.
Yes, the experiencing self versus the remembering self. The experiencing self is the one living life moment by moment. The remembering self is the one that keeps score, tells the stories, and, crucially, makes the decisions about the future. And the remembering self is weird. It's heavily influenced by two things: the peak intensity of an experience, good or bad, and how the experience ends. It largely ignores the duration of the experience. This is duration neglect and the peak end rule.
So a shorter, more intensely painful experience might be remembered as worse than a longer or less intensely painful one, even if the total amount of pain was greater in the longer one.
Exactly. The famous colonoscopy study showed this. Patients whose procedure ended with a few minutes of milder discomfort remembered the whole ordeal as less unpleasant than those whose procedure ended at the peak pain level, even if the first group experienced more total pain overall because their procedure was longer.
And they'd even choose the longer procedure again, based on the better memory.
Some did. The remembering self, the one making the choice, prioritized the better memory thanks to the better ending, even at the cost of more actual pain for the experiencing self. The remembering self is the storyteller, and it cares most about the highlights in the ending, not the total runtime.
Wow. That really makes you question how we measure happiness or well-being then. If our memory of an experience is so different from the experience itself.
It absolutely does. Asking someone, how happy are you with your life overall, taps into the remembering self. And that answer can be heavily swayed by their current mood or by what Kahneman calls the focusing illusion. The focusing illusion is our tendency to overestimate the importance of whatever we happen to be thinking about at that moment. Ask someone how much happier they'd be if they moved to California, and they'll likely focus on the climate, exaggerating its impact on overall well-being while neglecting all the other factors that stay the same or might even get worse.
We think buying that new car will make us permanently happier, focusing on the car itself, and forgetting we'll adapt to it pretty quickly.
Exactly. That's often called miswanting. We mispredict what will actually make our experiencing self happier in the long run. So Kahneman and others developed methods like the day reconstruction method, DRM, or the U-index, measuring the proportion of time spent in an unpleasant state, to try and capture the well-being of the experiencing self, moment by moment, rather than relying solely on the potentially biased global judgments of the remembering self. At the end of the day, our time, the minutes of our experiencing self, is our ultimate finite resource. But the remembering self, which makes most of our big choices, often doesn't seem to fully grasp that, prioritizing memorable peaks over sustained contentment.
So wrapping this all up, we've seen this constant back and forth between the fast, intuitive System 1 and a slow, effortful System 2. We've seen how different we are from the perfectly rational econs of economic theory. We're humans with all these predictable quirks. And we have these two selves experiencing and remembering, often pulling in different directions. It's quite a picture.
It really is. But I think the main point isn't to feel discouraged, like our minds are hopelessly flawed. It's more about recognition. Understanding these patterns, these common biases, is the absolutely critical first step. Once you can spot them, or at least suspect they might be influencing you, you have a chance to pause, engage System 2 more deliberately, and maybe nudge yourself, or even help design systems around you that lead to better judgments and more considered decisions.
Right. And maybe a final thought to leave everyone with, something Kahneman himself points out. Even knowing all this, you probably won't stop seeing the illusions, like the Muller-Lyer illusion with the arrows. You know, the lines are the same length, but they still look different. The biases might still feel intuitive. But the difference is, now you know that you know about them. You're aware that your intuition might be misleading you. So the real question is, how will you use that awareness? How might it help you be a little more engaged, maybe a bit less intellectually lazy, and perhaps importantly, more skeptical of your own gut feelings when the stakes are high? Something to think about until our next deep dive.